Last time we spoke about how France ended up in Indochina. Yes, while Britain got her hands very messy in China, France had likewise done the same in Southeast Asia. It began with the Jesuit priests trying to convert those to Catholicism, but they soon found themselves becoming increasingly more involved. The Newan Empire got weary of all these tiresome Catholics and they began to crack down on them, leading to conflicts with the French, and to a lesser extent with the Spanish. Before they knew it, a full-blown war had emerged where the Vietnamese tried desperately to fight off the Franco-Spanish force, but in the end they were forced to capitulate to brutal demands. Yet again, unequal treaties were placed upon a nation of the Far East, but worse than that, the French took colonial possession of what became known as French Indochina. Today we are going to continue that story. This episode is Francis Garnier's Insane Expedition. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just now finishing up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. This month's Patreon exclusive podcast is on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Please check it out, it'll mean a lot to me. So we ended off the last episode with the signing of the Treaty of Saigon. Yet again another unequal treaty in the East. It was harsh. The Newan Emperor, Tuedok, sent an embassy to France in 1863 trying to revise it. The embassy failed their mission as Napoleon III had no intentions of lightening his grip on his new territorial acquisitions. Those territorial acquisitions, to refresh your minds, were Bien Hoa, Gading, and Ding Tung. Thus, by 1864, France had acquired a large part of southern Vietnam and declared it the French colony of Cochin China. Also in August of 1863, the King of Cambodia, Norodom, signed a protectorate treaty with France cutting off the Kingdom of Siam and the Empire of Nguyen's suzerainty over his country. If you think that is humiliating, just wait to hear this. Emperor Tuedok's envoy to France, Phan Thanh Giản, returned to Vietnam and was nominated governorship over 3 southwestern provinces, Dinh Long, Châu Đô, and Hà Tien. His French counterpart, the governor of the new Cochin China, Pierre-Paul de la Grandière, was worried the 3 provinces to his west might be troublesome, so he secretly organized an expedition to occupy them. Perhaps Phan Thanh Giản was told, or perhaps not, but it seems the French convinced Tuedok to simply hand over the provinces, which he did. Phan Thanh Giản told his people not to resist. He awaited orders which never came, and he would kill himself via poisoning. Thus, France now controlled all of southern Vietnam. Emperor Tuedok officially handed the provinces over in the 1874 Treaty of Saigon. The treaty officially made the rest of Vietnam a protectorate of France, to which she promised military protection against the Qing dynasty. A large reason why the Vietnamese signed off on this was because of another event that occurred in 1873, known as the Garnier Affair. In 1873, the French explorer Jean Dupuy traveled up the Red River in an attempt to trade with Yunnan province, specifically to sell guns to its governor. Now, while that sounds bad, Dupuy also performed the heinous crime of carrying salt up the river. Yes, it turns out this was strictly prohibited by the Newan Empire. A dispute emerged and Dupuy found himself stuck in the district of Hanoi alongside 90 of his Chinese hired mercenaries. The Vietnamese feared French reprisals, thus instead of using force to try and get rid of them, they issued a complaint to the French admiral, Marie-Jules Dupré, who was acting governor of Cochin China at the time. Dupré seemed to think he had something to gain from the situation, so he sent an expedition, led by Lieutenant Francis Garnier, to Hanoi to solve the matter. Garnier took the ships D'Estrées and Fleureuse alongside 83 men. Another 60 men would join them 2 weeks later aboard the D'Estrées. The D'Estrées arrived at Tonkin on October the 23rd, while Garnier and his men traveled to Hanoi using some local junks. On November the 5th, Garnier's party arrived and met with Dupuy. Despite being told to tell Dupuy to simply leave, Dupuy managed to convince Garnier that he had been greatly mistreated by the forces led by one Marshal Nguyen Chi Phong. Garnier then tried to negotiate with the local Nguyen authorities, but they would not budge on anything, so Garnier decided military action was required. When the second part of his expeditionary forces arrived, plus some additional units he had requested, a total of 180 men, he decided to use them to capture Hanoi. Garnier wrote a letter and sent it back to Admiral Dupré, using the D'Estrées to justify his actions. Garnier took the 2 gunboats he had left, the Scorpion and Espagnole, and anchored them roughly 1,200 meters away from the walls of Hanoi, in a perfect position to fire upon her citadel, but being out of range of the Vietnamese cannons. On the morning of October the 20th, Lieutenant Garnier took a large portion of his forces towards the southeastern gate of Hanoi. Once they were in position, they began to fire upon its thick door. The Vietnamese defenders atop the walls attempted to fire down upon the enemy with their cannons, but they were placed en barbette instead of inside embrasure. Basically, they were aimed in such a way as to hit ships out of the water, and they could not be properly aimed downwards. The cannons failed to hit the French, while the French returned to fire using chassepot rifles. The defenders then tried to use some outdated, older-styled rifles, and as some eyewitnesses noted, they began throwing nails on the floor, which the French assumed was to try and stop them from walking closer to the wall. Regardless, the nails did not work. Once the gate had been demolished, the defenders began to rout, and the French quickly seized the southwestern entrance to the city. Meanwhile, the 2 gunboats bombarded the northern and western gates, and Garnier led another party to use land artillery to hit the southeastern gate. Garnier then entered through a breach, and this began a general rout for the enemy. Meanwhile, Dupuy and 30 of his mercenaries, including a former Ava member named Georges Vlavianos, held the eastern gate to make sure the enemy did not escape there. During the chaos of battle, some French came across Dupuy's force and assumed his Chinese mercenaries were Vietnamese defenders, and they began to fire upon them, causing some casualties, until Dupuy stopped them. In the end, Garnier took the city with a force of around 200 men, a city that held a population of 80,000. Marshal Chi Phong was captured alongside 2,000 of his soldiers. On November the 23rd, Garnier dispatched the Espagnole from Hanoi to obtain the submission of Nguyen officials at the fortified cities of Hung Nguyen and Phu Li. The next day, the small force aboard the Espagnole arrived to Hung Nguyen, and they met with some Nguyen officials. The officials promised the Europeans they would capitulate, as, quote, "You have managed to capture the great citadel of Hanoi. We will not have the audacity to attempt defending this one against you." Thus, the governor officially submitted, so the Espagnole left Hung Nguyen and proceeded for Phu Li. It was only 3 hours away. This time, the French found the doors closed to them, with a few defenders offering a fight. The French force began firing at those that they saw, and this caused the defenders to flee. The French entered Phu Li, finding some cannons, a few low-quality rifles, and a lot of rice and local currency. They waited a week holding the city, and on December the 1st, a Vietnamese man named Le Van Ba, whom Garnier had appointed to be in charge of Phu Li, arrived with a small militia force. The French force greeted them, handed over some weapons to help them garrison the city, and then proceeded to take the Espagnole to Haiphong. By the way, a small side note here. For those of you who are Americans listening, I myself am Canadian, and my knowledge of the Vietnam War is not that good, but one thing that I think you might notice is the way I'm pronouncing some of these towns and cities is specifically what Google Translate tells me is the Vietnamese pronunciation, but I do believe Americans would call these places something different. So for example, the town I just named, Haiphong, would be called something like Hai Dong by Americans. It's just for some of you who has a map out, and if you need recommendations, honestly, you can go to Wikipedia for this. They have quite a few battle maps that show roughly the most important cities that are going to be attacked and such. And yeah, you're going to notice the pronunciation of some of these cities is, well, I'll just say it, it's a little bizarre. Haizung held strong fortifications outfitted with a large number of cannons, including some more modern European ones, and was defended by roughly 2,000 men. The French delegation was met by the governor of Haizung, Dang Zongban, who politely had tea with them. The French demanded he come aboard their ship to officially begin handing over the city, so he politely refused to go aboard their ship. So a French officer threatened him, stating, "We will capture Haizung like we captured Hanoi." To this, the governor politely refused their demands again, notably being very charming and polite the entire time. The French went back to the Espangol carrying some gifts the governor had given them. The last thing they told the governor was if he did not come over to their boat by 3 p.m., the city would be considered an enemy. 3 p.m. went by without a sight of the governor, so the Espangol began to open fire on the citadel, firing 10 shells to devastating effect. The French then ceased their fire, hoping the damage to the citadel would incite the governor to surrender. The next day, a junk came to the Espangol, and aboard was an official, but not the governor himself. The French demanded the governor come himself, or they would continue their attack. Well, the governor did not show up, so at 8:30 at night, the Espangol made its way to fire on the nearest fort. The fort returned fire, but its cannons fired right over the Espangol's mast. The French sent 15 Marines and 12 sailors aboard 2 saipans to assault the fort. Once they got within 50 meters of the fort, they began to fire their rifles while routing the fort's defenders. They seized the fort with ease, which was 600 meters from the city's citadel. From the fort, they began to fire upon the Vietnamese soldiers nearby. And eventually, they began to march towards the citadel's main gate, but it did have a moat. From atop its walls, the Vietnamese were firing cannons, but the French simply waited for the cannons to fire and bolted towards the gate while they were all reloading. The French had brought no artillery nor scaling ladders, and they were forced to run around the citadel's walls looking for a weak spot to breach, which they did find at its southern end. By 10:15 a.m., the French got inside the citadel and hoisted the French flag from its highest tower. They captured a few hundred Vietnamese soldiers, but countless got away, including the polite governor. During that mess, the Espangol's party was informed the governor of Ninh Binh and some Hanoi officials who had run away during the battle were organizing forces to oppose the French. The Espangol received 400 reinforcements who had been sent up to help garrison their recent earnings. The Espangol commander sent word to Garnier about the Vietnamese building up a force to face them, prompting Garnier to send a force to subdue Ninh Binh. Garnier dispatched Aspirant Hautefeuille with a squad for the task, and en route he found out the Vietnamese were building large dams in the riverways to thwart their movements. Hautefeuille's force tore down the first dam operation only to find out another one was being built closer to Ninh Binh. They made their way to Ninh Binh, and Hautefeuille got aboard a canoe with some sailors to parley at its citadel. When they landed, they were swarmed by local civilians trying to give them gifts of oxen. As soon as the French reached the citadel's gates, they were swarmed by Vietnamese troops who prodded them with spears, trying to entice a battle. Hautefeuille noticed not too far away was the provincial governor, one Nguyen Vu. He recognized him because he had 4 parasols. Hautefeuille raised his pistol and he screamed at the governor to submit to Garnier. The governor replied he would submit wholeheartedly. So Hautefeuille went over to him with a paper and pen demanding he write down his submission officially and to allow him to escort the governor into the citadel. But to this the governor rejected. Apparently Hautefeuille grabbed the governor by his collar, put his pistol to the man's head and threatened to kill him. A tense standoff occurred until the governor gave in and soon the French flag was raised over the citadel. For this achievement, Hautefeuille would be appointed governor of the province by Garnier later in early December. Throughout early December, Garnier's garrison was attacked by Vietnamese guerrilla forces and hired Black Flag mercenaries. I had mentioned them once before, but to explain exactly who they are. They were remnants of a bandit group that had ventured into northern Vietnam from Guangxi province. Basically, they were products of the Taiping Rebellion, and when the Qing cracked down, they took up their shop and they left for Vietnam. Nuyen officials loved to hire them to fight off the French as they were experienced in fighting Westerners. Garnier ended up visiting some of the garrisons having issues with the attacks, offering reinforcements and instructions on how to hold on to their cities. On December the 18th, Garnier was back in Hanoi, receiving reports the Black Flags were becoming a real problem for its defenses. Garnier was just about to plan an assault on Santai, where it was alleged the Black Flags were operating, when all of a sudden a Nuyen envoy party showed up proclaiming a truce. Garnier began negotiations with the party, when on December the 21st, suddenly 2,000 Vietnamese soldiers led by Hoang Ke Viem and 600 Black Flags approached Hanoi. The Black Flags attacked Hanoi citadel while the Vietnamese forces held back a further kilometer away. The French lookout saw an elephant amongst their force, which indicated the presence of a high Nguyen official. Garnier distributed his men around the walls while his men used their French cannons upon the Black Flags, refusing to use the outdated Vietnamese swivel cannons. The French cannons began to cause a panic amongst the Vietnamese army, which quickly turned into a rout, while the Black Flag forces made an orderly retreat. Garnier was not satisfied with this, knowing full well they would attack again, so he decided to send a decisive blow against the Black Flags. Garnier sent Ensign Bernier d'Avricourt with a squad of 12 men to hit the enemy's left flank, while he took 18 men to hit the village of Toulay, around 1.2 kilometers southwest of the citadel, where it looked like the Black Flags were now holding up. The two French forces went their separate paths and met up to bombard Toulay. Garnier's force saw the Black Flag force withdrawing and pursued them only to run into a swamp. Quickly their cannons got stuck, but Garnier simply yelled at the men, "À la baïonnette en avant!" Garnier charged right through the swamp as his men tried to keep up with him. They were suddenly met with a volley from the Black Flag army, who had lured them into a trap, killing a few of the French right off the bat. Garnier was unhit, and he kept charging with his handgun in hand, but he tripped and fell. Upon seeing this, the Black Flag forces rushed forward and stabbed Garnier multiple times with spears and swords while firing at his comrades. The French retreated back to the citadel, losing more men, as the Nguyen forces took Garnier's head and some of the others back to Santé. Despite losing their leader, the French held on to the garrisons, sending word of his death and receiving word a new French envoy would be sent. At this point, French authorities had found out about Garnier's expedition, and they were quite embarrassed by the whole thing. Actually, they had found out a bit earlier, in late November, prompting Lieutenant Paul-Louis Félix Filat to relieve Garnier and to send a scathing letter to him that he never got a chance to read. "Have you thought about the shame that will befall upon you when it will be known that, having been sent to expel some ruffian, you allied yourself with him to attack people who hadn't even caused you any harm?" Lieutenant Filat arrived in Haiphong to meet with Nguyen officials to end the unsanctioned campaign. On December the 29th, Filat went to Haizung, where he ordered the garrisons to be evacuated, where the local French forces tried to persuade him otherwise. Filat then went to Hanoi to speak to some more Nguyen officials about his orders for the French to leave the cities that they had stolen. This led to the 1874 signing of the new Treaty of Saigon, where the French gave back some stolen cities, thus concluding what in essence was a short undeclared war. So to just try and summarize what we just said, Garnier had been sent to simply tell a guy caught smuggling to leave an area in Vietnam, only to begin a war stealing a bunch of major cities. The French government was deeply embarrassed by this ordeal, disavowing Garnier for his actions, but because of how incredible his accomplishments were, many in France began to see him as a hero. Indeed, he was romanticized, much like the conquistador Francisco Pizarro or Hernan Cortés. Absolute psychopaths that they were. So while you think, boy oh boy, France sure loves to send people on expeditions that results in them stealing territory, well, France was nowhere near done with this reoccurring activity. In 1881, the French naval officer Henri Rivier was sent with a small military force to Hanoi to investigate Nguyen complaints involving French merchants. Oh god, it's happening again. As you could already guess by now, Henri acted in defiance of the orders placed upon him. as he would later argue, based on the fact the Newan dynasty was not respecting the Treaty of Saigon, still having a tributary relation with China, was paying the Black Flags to attack the French in Southeast Asia, and not complying with the trade regulations, Henri took a force of 2 gunboats and some forces straight to the citadel of Hanoi, and he stormed it. When he showed up to Hanoi, he told the Nguyen officials he was simply leading his forces to stamp out the Black Flag soldiers in the area. But instead, he immediately set to work stationing his forces within the citadel. The governor, Huang Xiao, was given an ultimatum to have his forces stand down. But instead, Huang Xiao sent a letter of apology to his emperor, and he killed himself. It was yet again another embarrassment for France, who handed Hanoi back over to the Nguyen officials, but Henri was not done yet. In the meantime, Henri's actions pushed the Newan Empire to seek aid from the Qing dynasty and the Black Flag Army. The Qing, seeking to help their Vietnamese allies, but not at the cost of incurring the wrath of France again, said they would aid them via the Black Flags. In the summer of 1882, Chinese forces from Yunnan and Guangxi provinces crossed the border into Tonkin, beginning to covertly occupy Hunghua, Bac Ninh, Langsun, and some other cities. The French and the Qing saw the paint on the wall, despite the covert activity, leading Hong Zhang and the French envoy to try and work out a deal where they would divide Tonkin into French and Qing-controlled spheres of influence. But the deal never came to fruition. Thus, both sides gradually increased their power in the region, and in February of 1883, France sent a 500-man battalion of Marines led by Lieutenant Colonel Carrot to Hanoi, who would be at the disposal of Henri Rivier. On the other side, the Nguyen officials received aid from the warlord and leader of the Black Flag Army, Liu Yongfu. Liu Yongfu came from Guangxi province, and he joined a local militia during the Taiping Rebellion. Some claim this militia also fought for the Taiping. When the Taiping Rebellion came to a close, Liu Yongfu's prospects looked dire, so he took his forces southwest, until they were finally pushed to cross the border into northern Tonkin. Liu Yongfu then established a camp outside Santai, where he formed the Heiqi Black Flag Army. And apparently this was based on his dream of becoming General of the Black Tiger. Though seen initially as an invader, the Vietnamese officials also were surprised at how proficient the Black Flag Army was, and reasoned it would be difficult to dislodge them. I can't really go into it too much, but basically, the Black Flag Army was in competition with another army called the Yellow Flag Army, who had a similar background, and the Black Flag Army certainly beat the shit out of them. And this really impressed the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese reasoned if the Black Flag Army could be hired to fight their enemies, well, that served them just fine. When the Black Flags killed Garnier, they certainly earned their praise from the Vietnamese, who would increasingly call upon them. Henri Rivier, upon receiving the new forces, was instructed specifically that they were not to venture past the French-occupied parts of Tonkin. Thus, Henri did the opposite of that, because French. He had learnt in early March of 1883 the Nguyen government was planning to lease some coal mines in Hanoi to the Qing dynasty, but this surprisingly proved to be a front for the British, ironically enough. Now, if the British were to gain this, it would spell the end of French colonial expansion in Tonkin, and this was something Rivier would have none of. And to be perfectly honest, let's be honest with each other, it's the British. They're going to screw with the British. They're French. Rivier ordered Commandant Berthe de Villers to take 50 Marines aboard the Passeval to seize Hanoi. And they did this meeting zero resistance. As Rivier put in a letter to the governor of Cochin China, Charles Thompson, "I have taken possession of the entire mining district. We have always coveted it, but have always hesitated to act. This will force them to take forward their Tonkin question." Now, Rivier did not just stop there. He received word that Liu Yongfu was preparing to attack Hanoi with an army of 5,000 Black Flag troops. Over in Namin, their citadel had been warned by their governor of an incoming battle, prompting Rivier to act first. In Rivier's words, "As this indecisive government has been imprudent enough to send me 500 men, I have decided to use them to do what it did not decide I should do. Rivier elected to strike at Namin, similar to how Garnier did in 1873. Namin was defended by around 6,000 Nguyen soldiers and 500 Chinese soldiers led covertly by the Black Flag officer, Vinh Dong Chat. These Chinese soldiers wore the Black Flag army uniforms, but in reality they were trained Qing troops. French reconnaissance indicated around 8,000 men defending Namin. Regardless, Rivier decided to go forward and attack the city with just 520 men. They traveled up the Red River using 6 gunboats, reaching Namin by March the 25th. They quickly went to work seizing the naval barracks, which were unoccupied. They also cleared fields of huts to set up firing lanes for their gunboats and set up artillery pieces on land. The next morning, the bombardment began as Rivier simultaneously summoned the governor of Namin, Vu Truambing, to come to his ship, the Rivier, to submit the citadel before 8 a.m. Governor Vu Truambing was able to reject this before 8 a.m. Namin had 15 thick walls, unscalable and pretty much impossible to breach via cannons. Thus, Rivier decided to force an entrance into the city by destroying one of its main gates with explosives. While his gunboats and artillery smashed the Vietnamese cannons along the walls, on March the 27th, his marines went ashore carrying some dynamite to blow up a gate. The French then charged the citadel under heavy fire, with Rivier at the front urging them on. The Vietnamese soldiers were overwhelmed by the superior firepower, and by the afternoon the city had fallen as the governor fled. Rivier jubilantly stated, "This will force them to take forward their Tonkin question." Now, Rivier expected to be punished for his renegade actions, but he lucked out enormously, for back home in France there was a change of government. The new administration, led by Jules Ferry, strongly supported colonial expansion and backed Rivier up from the offset. The new government followed this up by sending word to Li Hangjiang that Tonkin was going to be under French protection and to back off immediately. The Nguyen officials were now in quite a plight without their Qing defenders, and wholeheartedly tossed their lot in with Liu Yongfu and the Black Flags. I would like to take this time to remind you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just finishing up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Francis Garnier died in a blaze of glory, or insanity, and now it seemed he had a successor, who was found 10 years later in Henri Rivier. Would Southeast Asia be able to thwart off the colonizing efforts of France, or fall like domino pieces?